Good morning, everyone. This morning I'm joined by the Minister for Emergency Services, Steph Cooke, Daniel Austin, the Deputy Commissioner for the SES, and also Dean Narramore from the Bureau of Meteorology. Unfortunately, over the past 24 hours, we've seen torrential rainfall that has continued to land in the Northern Rivers area. And this has landed in an area that is already saturated from recent rainfall. Now, this has been an extremely difficult time for these communities. And it's what we've seen with this torrential rainfall has been flash flooding within those areas. When you have a look at the rainfall, no one could have predicted some of the amounts of rainfall that we've seen land. If you look at Alstonville, in the last 24 hours, we've seen 430 millimetres of rain land within these communities. Now, 4 weeks ago, these communities were impacted by heavy rainfall in that area. No one could have predicted that we would be back here again. For many people, they were just starting to go back into their homes. For a lot of people, they were going back into their businesses. For many people, they were just starting to open the doors of their business again. And now they've been impacted by further flooding. Some of those areas that have been impacted the most in those areas have been around Lismore, Ballina, Byron, Corrocky and Woodburn, just to name a few. We have seen rivers rising very quickly in some areas. Some areas will also see flooding over the next 24 hours, even once we see the rains move on from those communities. The rain itself is expected to move down to the mid-north coast over the coming days as well. When we have a look at this, it's an evolving situation. It's changing, and it can change hour by hour for those communities. That is why I do say to the communities in those areas, please listen to the advice that is given by the SES, the emergency services teams within those areas. They are volunteers, but they are acting on the advice that is needed to keep you and your community safe. I also want to remind people that if you are travelling in and around those areas, stay out of floodwaters. Again, do not risk it. Do not put your life at risk, and then do not put the lives of emergency services and volunteers' lives at risk as well, just to rescue you. I want to indicate that we are still expecting a very wet period over the coming months. We may be in this situation come back again in weeks' time. April is expected to be quite wet in many parts of the state, and we know that we want to work with these communities during this difficult time. When you have a look at the ground, it is saturated. We only have to see a small amount of rainfall landing in some of these areas. In a lot of cases, I want to reiterate that we didn't see 25 to 50 mils. In some cases, we actually saw anything right up to 430 millimetres. This doesn't take much rainfall to see those rivers running again, encroaching their banks, seeing riverine flooding, flash flooding within those communities. But we also need to be aware that we could still see landslips occurring within those communities. And over the next few days, there is expected to be some high winds. And that has the real possibility of bringing trees down within those communities. Again, I know it has been extremely difficult for those communities, but I do want to say once again, thank you to the communities for responding. Thank you to the work of our SES and all our volunteers out there on the ground that have been working in these communities. I'll now hand over to the Minister for Emergency Services.
Thank you, Acting Premier. Well, good morning, everyone. And as you've heard from the Acting Premier this morning, and you'll shortly hear from the Bureau of Meteorology and the SES, it's been a very, very difficult night for communities across the Northern Rivers region and the mid-north coast, particularly Lismore, Ballina, Byron and the surrounding smaller communities. Unfortunately, overnight, our worst fears have been realised with significant heavy rainfalls across already saturated landscapes, particularly across the Northern Rivers region and the mid-north coast. This has resulted in flash flooding in a number of communities and riverine flooding. We've seen earlier today that the Wilsons River has once again overtopped the levee at Lismore. We know that that levee now very well is 10.6 metres and that river continues to rise at this time. We're also seeing power lines being brought down across those regions, and it's a special reminder and call out to communities to be very, very careful at this time as you move about. We encourage you not to move unless you really need to at this time. We should be treating all power lines as if they are live, and we will, of course, as the weather conditions ease, look to get power restored as quickly as possible. There's around about 3,500, 3,600 homes presently without power, and we will look to get that power restored as quickly as possible and make the streets safe again in relation to fallen power lines. The weather system, as we have been saying now for quite some time, particularly over the last few days, is evolving and changing rapidly. And to that end, I once again encourage communities to please listen to our emergency services organisations, particularly the SES, but also the Bureau of Meteorology in relation to the warnings that they continue to issue as more information comes to light about what this weather system is doing, and really take heed of their advice, because we're all working together to the best of our abilities to keep people, families and our communities more broadly safe at this time. There are currently 10 evacuation orders in place and 8 evacuation warnings. And that may change throughout the day, and if it does so, it's likely to change quickly, and we therefore ask people to be on alert and ready to move as required. Our emergency services organisations, led by the SES, continue to work together very closely, as they have done over the past 5 or 6 weeks in particular, to keep our communities safe. And on that note, I really, really want to say thank you, particularly to our volunteers in each of the emergency services organisations, the SES, the RFS, we've got Fire and Rescue, the Volunteer Rescue Association, Surf Life Saving and Marine Rescue. Everyone is pulling together at this time, doing our very best to keep our communities safe. And I know the volunteers are very fatigued. This has been an ongoing campaign now for many weeks. We're very, very grateful. We need you to keep going. I know I've said that before, but please do so, because our communities are really relying on the emergency services to keep them safe at this time. I'd also like to say thank you to the ADF, who are tasked almost entirely with supporting the SES at this time, undertaking numerous activities, including door knocking, to make sure that we can reach everyone, and if they need to be evacuated, to let them know, potentially with short notice. So thank you very much to the ADF for their during this time. I think finally, I'd like to say to communities that we as a state have faced many natural disasters, and particularly in the last few years, whether it's droughts or bushfires and now floods. We know that this wet weather is likely to continue for some time, right throughout April and potentially beyond that. I have watched firsthand our communities face trials and tribulations and all that Mother Nature can throw at us day after day for years now. As many people know, home for me is west of the Divide, where we experienced the worst of the drought over an almost 5-year period. So I know that for many of you in the Northern Rivers region and the mid-north coast, it must feel as though this flooding emergency is never going to end. But I can assure you that there is light at the end of the tunnel. We will get through this disaster. I have seen firsthand the resilience of your communities and how you've pulled together during this time, which has been very, very difficult for so many. I know that this current situation is another blow on top of what you've already experienced, but we will pull together, we will continue working alongside you, and we will get through this. There is light at the end of the tunnel. We will stay on this journey until we get out the other side. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Dean from the Bureau of Meteorology. Well, it's been a stressful and obviously a devastating night for many of our communities in northeastern parts of New South Wales. Last night we had a small but intense low pressure system that rapidly developed just off the coast of the Northern Rivers, and that developed an area of intense thunderstorms around the Evans Head area late last night, and that continued to expand and move northwards and westwards as the low wound up, and that it moved through much of our Northern Rivers areas. Now, with that, it was associated with incredibly heavy rainfall. We saw numerous locations experience 90 to 100 millimetres an hour with these thunderstorms, and we saw widespread communities from Evans Head up to Byron Bay experiencing 200 to 300 millimetres in just a few hours. And unfortunately, that caused significant and destructive flash flooding through the communities of Ballina and Byron Bay and many others in between. Obviously, that rain then moved in towards the Lismore area overnight, and that brought some heavy rainfall through large parts of the Wilson's catchment. And we have numerous rivers experiencing major flooding as we speak right now. The Wilson's River is in major flood, and earlier this morning, water started breaching parts of the levee. And with all the water that has fallen in this area, we're expecting the rivers to continue to rise. We're seeing major flooding also further down around the Northern Rivers area, Coffs Harbour and Ballinger. We saw widespread 300 millimetres, Dorrigo over 300, Ballinger also over 300 millimetres there, and we're experiencing major flooding on the Ballinger River. We're also, as all this rainfall continues in the creeks and streams to move into the rivers, we're going to see numerous rivers, Macleay, Clarence as well, likely to increase as we move through today as well. And while the rain has eased in the northern rivers as this low has weakened this morning and will start shifting offshore, the focus of the heavy rainfall will continue around the mid-north coast. But even if the sun does come out later today in the northern rivers, there is a lot of water in our creeks and streams that are flowing into these rivers, and we're likely to see the Wilsons and the Richmond continue to rise today. So obviously the communities of Lismore are always seeing major flooding through there. Further downstream, Corrocky, Woodburn, also likely to see major flooding as we move into this morning and afternoon hours. And then as we move further south as well, that rainfall will continue, as I mentioned earlier, around the Coffs Harbour area and also further down towards the Port Macquarie area. We've had warnings out for numerous days now for severe weather warning, and including the chance for thunderstorms to bring intense and life-threatening flash flooding. And unfortunately last night those storms developed right over the communities of Byron Bay, Evans Head, Yamba and also Ballina. So please, if you live on the Wilsons, on the Richmond, on the Ballinger River and any of the rivers in between, even though the rain has stopped in your part of the world, there's been some intense rainfall numbers. As you heard earlier, Ashtonville had 430 millimetres, and many areas on the coast and just inland saw falls anywhere from 200 to 350 millimetres. Now that water will make its way into these rivers later this morning and today, and we're likely to see continued river level rises as we go through today from many of our communities on or near rivers. So as we've been saying for the few days, and we'll continue to say, if you live on and near any rivers, creeks and streams, please stay up to date with the latest forecast and warnings and listen to all advice from emergency services, because as we saw last night, these coastal troughs and small-scale low-pressure systems are always rapidly evolving and quickly changing weather systems. Sometimes they fall on the coast, sometimes they fall off the coast. Unfortunately, this time it formed right on the coast rapidly overnight, causing intense and torrential rainfall that caused the widespread flooding that we saw through our communities. So if you're on the Wilsons, downstream of the Wilsons, downstream on the Richmond, or as we get further to the coast, and also around the Ballinger and Dorrigo area, please stay up to date with the latest forecasts and warnings. We're continuing to update them every few hours as this situation continues to evolve. Stay up to date with the latest forecasts and warnings via our website, app and social media. And as always, listen to all advice from emergency services. And with that, I'll now hand you over to the Acting Commissioner.
Thank you, Dean. Good morning, everybody. The SES continues to respond to significant and widespread flooding across the north coast and the northern rivers parts of New South Wales. Together with our partner agencies, we continue to respond in places in very short notice with significant resources around to deal with the situations that we've actually are facing. The situation that we saw overnight developed exceptionally quickly, and we were in a position to respond to flash flooding as it came up in certain parts, particularly in places like Lismore, and further then across to the coast to Ballina and to Byron Bay and surrounds. We will continue over the coming days and weeks to work with our partner agencies and the community to issue warnings and to respond to these serious conditions as they come. As Dean has said, there is an expectation that we will see heavy rain and heavy flooding for a number of days yet to come across these communities on the mid-north coast and across the Northern Rivers area. In the last 24 hours, the SES has responded to over 40 flood rescues in this particular area, many of which were from people trying to drive through floodwaters. We once again ask people not to drive through floodwaters and to stay away from these environments. We've also been saying for a number of days that this system was highly dynamic and was going to move across and down through the Northern Rivers onto the mid-north coast. And that is what we continue to see. Whilst overnight we saw certainly some significant flash flooding in the Northern Rivers area, we also saw exceptionally high totals of rainfall down through Coffs Harbour, and they were also accompanied by the very strong winds that we've been talking about. We've been saying, as I said, for a number of days that the community needed to stay across the weather conditions and across their current surroundings to understand what their conditions were and what their risks were. And we continue to ask that of the community, and we will continue to ask that for some days yet. This morning we've seen the levee in and around Lismore start to overtop, and that will lead to additional flooding compounded by the flash flooding environment that we saw overnight. That water will move its way down through the Wilsons and the Richmond River systems into communities as it works its way towards the coast. And we have already issued a number of warnings for communities downstream of Lismore to start to prepare and to put in their plans for as this water makes its way towards them. As we've also been talking about, there is widespread strong wind expected to occur with this system, and that will now lead to also seeing trees down and power lines down and the like. And we ask the community to stay away from down power lines and treat all down power lines as live and as a danger to them. Finally, yesterday afternoon, based on the conditions that we saw, we did release the evacuation order for Lismore based on the local consultation that we undertook and also the advice on the weather conditions that were coming. At this point in time, that advice was the right advice to enable the community to try to restore and work through its recovery process. As we then saw, some hours later, we then saw a significant thunderstorm form over the Lismore area, which led to that extreme flash flooding event. The community reacted well through the evening to start to respond. A number of emergency text messages and warnings and orders were subsequently issued for that community as well. And the SES did undertake a number of flood rescues to assist people move from that area. Moving forward, I'm asking the community to continue to listen to the warnings, to listen to the advice, but to stay aware of what their surroundings are and what their conditions are. You need to be aware of the risk that is posed to you in your area. Should there be a need for emergency assistance, the SES number, as always, is 132 500 and 000 for all life-threatening emergencies. Thank you very much.
Actually, Commissioner, Steve Krieg, the Lismore Mayor, says that your messaging and the Bonds messaging, I know everyone has the best of intentions, cannot be relied upon anymore. And as an example, 9:30 this morning, the levee's topped. The social media message from the SES about that has come out at 10:07. and you've both said, listen to the messaging. How can that be reliable?
So the messaging has also been through the night and over the last few days to stay aware of your surroundings and to be across what is coming. So we talked yesterday afternoon about the potential for levee overtop. We talked again during the night about potential for levee overtop. Emergency text messages were also issued during the night to the community, and the warnings were also issued during the night. So we have continued to provide information to those communities. Council have been involved in discussions through the local emergency management centres to ensure that we get local information and that we work with the community to provide the most timely and most up-to-date possible information that we can.
But that message this morning is 40 minutes. 40 minutes after what had occurred at the levee.
But that, as I said before, that messaging was also going out last night.
Sure, you now can see it was the wrong decision though to lift it yesterday, given you've had people evacuating at night, they're confused.
If we had a crystal ball, then you may make different decisions. The reality is you make your decisions based on the information that you have at the time. And the information that we had at the time was that the rivers were falling and that the conditions that we expected were no longer going to present. The expectation yesterday afternoon was that the river would get to or about the top of the levee. And as a result, that is one of the triggers for us to issue evacuation products. And we dealt with those evacuation products. As the conditions changed and the rainfall changed, then we revised those forecasts. And in fact, it's important to note the river level actually went down again after the order was revoked. So the decisions made at the time were made absolutely with the information that we had and what we expected to occur over the coming 12 to 24 hours.
But the rain gauges in Lismore, for example, were apparently inaccurate during manual inspections. We also heard that the sirens aren't working. So we know you don't have a crystal ball, but can't those basic fundamental mechanics be fixed to make them more accurate?
So we know there are a number of pieces of infrastructure, quite a number of pieces of infrastructure across the communities, across the entirety of the Northern Rivers, that are still damaged, be they roads, be they gauges, be they bridges, be they whatever they may be. There are a number of those that are still out and they are still being repaired. And the community, all of us as a community, are working as quickly as we can to restore all of those pieces of infrastructure to enable this to work. As we said, and as Dean has pointed out, what fell last night was not expected, and certainly not to the intensity. And if you remember standing here yesterday when we talked about this, we were talking rainfall totals of in the 50 to 100 millimetres a park. We've heard 430.
Byron and Ballina, just a quick question on that. Why were evacuation orders not declared for those particular areas?
So what we've seen in Byron and Ballina is a result of flash flooding. And flash flooding by its very nature is unpredictable, fast, and exceptionally hard to forecast and to predict. So what we have seen, as we saw it this morning as people woke up, was that yes, areas of Byron, Ballina and surrounds had all actually seen significant rainfall totals overnight, and we have seen flash flooding across those areas. I want to reiterate my message. We have been warning for a number of days that there was a chance of weather systems in that area creating flash flooding and creating riverine flooding. This is not something new. We have been saying this for a number of days and warning of this as we have gone.
Is there even an evacuation centre in Byron? Because on social media people are saying that they've got no information.
There is an evacuation centre set up in Byron, yes.
To the Minister and the
Acting Premier.
yeah, if I could, emergency warning siren, it sounds like the most basic thing to respond to an emergency. Were you aware that it still wasn't working, even 1 month on from the past floods?
Look, I wasn't aware, but I will make this point. You know, we've seen significant flooding within those communities. Having been up there and walked on the ground and spoken to community members, just to see the damage in those communities is immeasurable. This is a huge task to bring those communities and build that infrastructure back to what it was previously. They've been hampered in that time also by rainfall that's landed in those communities. It is something that, you know, we seriously need to be looking at. and it is something as acting Premier I'll be putting a priority
How
to.
is it that you were not aware, though? It's the most basic flood response, a siren when the level's over top.
Well, there's lots of things. There's also pumps required for flood mitigation as well that have been damaged in those areas. Not only that, we've got roads that have been damaged. All of these are important pieces of infrastructure required in those communities. But that's not the only piece of messaging that went out to the communities. I stood here at the start of this week also putting a message out to the communities that it could be a tough week for them, that they may be going to experience flooding in those areas. And what we've seen now is significant flooding. As has already been stated, this is flash flooding. We don't need much rainfall. Our dams are full, our streams are full, our rivers are full. So we've only got to see small amounts of rainfall landing in the right area, causing those rivers to rise very quickly. And this, unfortunately, is causing flash flooding.
Is this proof, Acting Premier, that like the RFS had back in the 80s and 90s, the SES needs a massive increase in funding?
Well, I think first I want to say that the SES are doing an incredible job. And I think we all have to acknowledge that they are being in those communities, they are working tirelessly. And I want to say thank you to all of them for the incredible commitment and the work that they have done. I also know that they've had teams that have been supporting them that have travelled from other parts of the state to be in the Northern Rivers as well, lending assistance to ensure that they are supported during this difficult time. We also have an inquiry. That inquiry itself, I'm sure, is going to outline a number of changes and things that may need to happen as we go forward. And if it is around resourcing the SES, then that's something I believe will come out through an inquiry.
Janelle Sappin was critical yesterday, I think she has previously, of the fact that the SES is headquartered in Wollongong. Given you have this wonderful resource here, I know you're working out here at the moment, but shouldn't the SES be here full time?
Well, this is the State Emergency Operations Centre, and this has got all agencies working here under the one roof. Anyone that walks around this organisation can see that it's coordinated. We've got police, we've got RFS, we've got Rural Fire and Rescue New South Wales, the SES, all in one building. So we're able to ensure that it is a coordinated approach from a state level. But let's not forget, we also have local emergency operations centres as well. There is one that is set up in our Coffs Harbour. There is one where we set up in other communities, but we get local information. That's got transport involved in it. So we know when roads have got to reopen, what infrastructure's been damaged. We've got telcos involved in that. We've got the ADF. So there is also a structure outside of the State Command that actually identifies at a local level.
All these issues in Lismore come while Resilience New South Wales has still not spent $400 million of its budget. It's spent about less than $6 million in grants to build resilience for disasters. Should more of that budget be directed to make sure basics are working? I mean, why does it have so many bureaucratic fat cats when we don't even have working sirens?
Well, I think we can always look at doing things better, and I want to make that commitment that we always should. But I do make the point that there are no two natural disasters the same. You look at flooding. I mean, at the moment, flooding, whilst we're seeing it unfortunately hitting those communities again, I mean, they must feel as though they've been to hell and back, and to be in this situation once again, dealing with more flooding in those communities. But we also shouldn't be pointing the finger at anyone at this point in time. I think the inquiry will identify what needs to change, how we can do things better, but importantly at the moment, it's about communities keeping them safe. It's about people, and that's what we need to be focusing on.
Just for Minister Cooke as well. We've seen this considerable flooding in Lismore once again after the events last month. The area's been known to be flood prone. Is it time for us to take more stronger measures to get people to move out of floodplains, since it just seems to keep happening?
Well, as the Acting Premier has stated, that is yet another aspect that will be considered with the inquiry, the independent inquiry that the government has stood up. There are discussions, of course, being held in and amongst the community of Lismore itself in relation to its future. And we know that they are a very resilient community, that they have been through flood after flood after flood since its inception. But as we look to the future, we know that whether all communities, large and small, and all levels of government can do things better and differently, and we need to prepare for the future in that sense.
But should we then be having the inquiry sooner, because we're investing in rebuilding Lismore right now, but we don't know if we should be really doing those things because we haven't had the full inquiry yet?
The inquiry is underway as we speak, and they have a reporting deadline back to the 30th of June, particularly in relation to those planning matters. So we very much look forward to what that inquiry, finds out.
Will there be public hearings with the inquiry? I know there's an upper house inquiry, but will there be public hearings?
Yes, there will be.
Will they be in Sydney or actually up there?
They will be wherever the two people leading the inquiry, being Mr Fuller and Professor O'Kane, decide to hold them. What we do know is that previously in the independent inquiry into the bushfires, which Professor O'Kane was also a lead on, they did conduct a number of inquiry sessions in the communities that were most impacted, and I would hope that that would be their intention this time.
Can I just do the question? Sorry, it's a little bit off topic. Just in regards to Sydney, is the Hawksman being out of the woods for the next couple of days?
Yep.
Is it clear?
Yeah, so for the central parts of New South Wales, the main threat as the low moves offshore and really deepens well offshore, I must push that, it's going to be well offshore as we go into later this week. There's going to be more of a wind and hazardous surf threat for large parts of the central and northern coast of New South Wales. So we're going to see those winds pick up, especially for our coastal communities, particularly on Thursday and Friday. And we're likely to see dangerous and hazardous surf as well for our central and northern coast, particularly those that are south-facing. We could see inundation of low-lying properties right on the coast, and also coastal erosion as well. And bringing back to your point around the Hawkesbury and Nepean, we're only expecting showers over the next few days. We're not expecting anything moderate or major on the Hawkesbury and Nepean.
I'm just interested to know, the acting Premier opened the press conference by saying no one could have predicted the level of rain that we've seen. I'm interested to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, look, so from Saturday we've been having a severe weather warning was current pretty much from the Queensland border all the way down to around Kempsey. It's been extended yesterday down to Foster, but in that warning it did include, with these intense thunderstorms, we could have life-threatening flash flooding with 6-hourly totals of 50 to 180 millimetres and possible isolated falls up to and in excess of 300 millimetres. Now, it's always hard to pinpoint exactly where these thunderstorms will occur, as these are always dynamic and rapidly evolving systems. But we have been warning for the last few days about that, covered by our severe weather warning, with heavy rainfall, with localised areas of intense rainfall possible.
Is there more we could be doing though, so that we can predict these levels of rain?
Yeah, so I think it's all about the messaging, and I think the other thing as well is these warnings have been out since Saturday, and we update them every 3 to 6 hours. So it's been Saturday, it's now Wednesday, it happened on Tuesday night. You know, if it hasn't occurred over your area, you think, oh, it's not going to happen, but it does, you know, and that's why this warning has been out for days, and it's just so important to continue to keep updated. I know it is hard, and when this does happen at night time, obviously people are asleep, and then these things escalate rapidly. It's pretty hard to stay up to date with that, but the warning's been out for a while, and just constant messaging about this threat is possible. Watch the radar, watch the latest forecasts and warnings on our website, updated every few hours, and obviously we work very closely with the SES. And once the situation did change late last night, yesterday, we upgraded our warnings around the midnight hour, briefed SES, and we're looking at possible overtopping of the levy early this morning.
On that, are the people probably scratching their heads thinking the last flood event was unpredicted, this flood event's unpredicted? Are these things getting more unpredictable?
Yeah, so...
Yes. And so what do we do, you know?
Yeah.
Like
Look, it's a good question. And
Rethink the way we're doing weather forecasting.
yeah,
And, you know, we're currently, one of the things we are working on is we're moving into these, what we call, it's a bit off topic here, but moving into high resolution modelling. So what that is kind of, we run the model over an area, but it's a much finer scale, so it can pick up these convective elements. Now, convection has always been a really tough element of weather forecasting because they are rapid. We know with thunderstorms, even here in Sydney, you know, it can be a sunny day, and then rapidly we've got large hail falling in the western suburbs. And these kind of events as well, as you keep hearing us talking about, you know, these are dynamic, rapidly evolving weather systems, particularly when they're sitting near or just off the coast, because when they just move 30 to 50 kilometres in either direction, the impacts can be massive, as unfortunately we have seen in the northern rivers. So we are working in the Bureau on developing these high resolution models, getting more observations into these models. And you've got to also remember weather is a constantly changing thing. You know, it's not an exact science, and we are getting there and we're doing really well. And unfortunately, we've seen what happened last night.
During the bushfires in 2019, I remember the Bureau saying that because of the closure of some of the smaller weather stations, it made it harder to predict the weather events, and there were some inaccuracies there. Does the same apply to floods? And can we invest in more smaller weather stations to try and help with that?
Yeah, look, I'm not sure exactly from the fires in 2019, 2020, which we know was devastating. We do have an amazing observation network, and we do have a lot of flood gauges on many of our rivers along much of eastern Australia. And we also have weather stations that are also across many areas. Now, we run the weather stations, and obviously a lot of people have some personal weather stations as well that they do have. But we're upgrading our radars as well. That's another key component. We're continuing to upgrade and build new radars around the country as well. But in the world of meteorology and weather, we can never have enough data, and it's important to continue to feed that data into our models and systems because, yeah, these things rapidly change. And we're dealing with something that is very large. The atmosphere, I'm getting really off top, it's 20 kilometres, but, really widespread. So, I'll stop with that. All good?
Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bit of a weather lesson there.
Every day.